Number 4. Bon Voyage. It was May 1845 when the HMS Erebus and the HMS Terror sailed from England on an Arctic mission to navigate the Northwest Passage and to study the Earth's magnetic field. This mission required the best officers, crew, and vessels. After all, successfully navigating the Northwest Passage was no small task, and it had been a dream of many sailors for hundreds of years. The Northwest Passage was a water route that linked the Atlantic Ocean to the Pacific Ocean. Captains and crews would have to sail south from Europe to Africa around the Cape of Good Hope. Then from there they'd sail the Indian Ocean towards the Pacific. The other option was to sail towards South America and get past the dreaded Tierra del Fuego before sailing up into the Pacific. Both were dreadful voyages, so there had to be an easier way, and that way eluded the best sailors on Earth. After the exploration of the Arctic Circle and the North Pole, sailors knew that the Northwest Passage was no easy feat. It was a treacherous journey through an archipelago of islands surrounded by ice that was moving. Only the best and the most brave would survive. The other part of the mission was to get a better understanding of Earth's magnetic field. This voyage was a way to study the magnetic poles, which would allow for easier navigation. Improving navigational equipment at the time meant using Earth's magnetic field to guide sailors on voyages. The voyage of the Erebus and Terror was led by Sir John Franklin and his crew of 128 men. Franklin had an impressive naval resume going back to 1800 when he was 14 years old. Franklin had been involved in some naval battles, including the Battle of Trafalgar. He'd even sailed to the Arctic and northwestern Canada, but there was one glaring issue with Franklin leading the mission. He hadn't been on a voyage to the Arctic or the Antarctic for nearly 3 decades. However, he was the man selected for the mission. It's also important to note that along the voyage there were 2 very skilled officers named Francis Crozier and James Fitzjames. Crozier was an Irishman born in Banbridge in 1796, and like Franklin, Crozier joined the Navy at a young age. He went on an Arctic voyage to navigate the Northwest Passage when he was 25 years old. It was one of a series of voyages that Crozier went on that were unsuccessful. Crozier's experience on the seas allowed him to develop his scientific skills. So by 1849, he was one of the top minds when it came to studying the Earth's magnetic field. But due to his Irish background, Crozier was never given the respect he deserved from the British. James Fitzjames was an illegitimate child who was born in London, England in 1813, and he too began his career on the seas at a young age, starting when he was just 12 years old. Fitzjames had been adopted into a good family, and his reputation as a sailor was solidified in his 20s. Fitzjames spoke a handful of languages and served during the Opium War in China. He was known for his bravery and was a skilled officer on any ship he was assigned. His past as an illegitimate child followed him his whole career, though. It was a potential career killer at the time, and Fitzjames had built a solid resume. However, he was missing something important. Fitzjames, for all of his honors, had never been on an Arctic expedition. Sir John Franklin had the perfect duo for the voyage. Both the Erebus and Terror were excellent ships and were equipped for Arctic travel. The Terror was the older ship and was built in 1813 as a bomb vessel. The purpose of these ships was to bomb forts or cities that were situated along the coast. The Terror was used during the War of 1812 but was eventually turned into an explorer ship. One of its earliest voyages as an explorer ship was an 1836 trip to the Arctic. The Erebus was the younger ship, and it was built in 1826. Both the Erebus and the Terror were used for an Antarctic expedition that began in 1839. This would be one of many journeys to the region. The 2 ships somehow survived crashing into large chunks of ice floating in the ocean, and during one expedition to the Antarctic, the Erebus and Terror crashed into each other because one of the ships tried to avoid an iceberg. When it was time for Franklin's expedition to the Arctic, both ships had steam-powered engines, and the steam was piped through them as a heating system. The officers and crew would be subject to below-freezing conditions, and they needed not to succumb to hypothermia. For the journey to the Arctic, they had their bows reinforced with additional wood and iron so they could handle sailing through icy waters. The Erebus and Terror had equipment on board to desalinate ocean water for drinking purposes and to power the steam engines. There was also more sophisticated equipment on board that allowed the crew to study the magnetic field of Earth. This expedition would not be easy. The ships Erebus and Terror were supposed to sail to the most frigid parts of Canada and stay there for the winter because of the extremely cold weather and icy conditions. They would be able to navigate the waters and journey the Northwest Passage during the summer when the ice wasn't as big of an issue for the ships. They needed to set sail during the summer because they had 3 months to take advantage of the conditions. They would need plenty of calories to survive, and they had some 8,000 cans of food. Most importantly, there was plenty of alcohol on board the ships to raise morale. There was enough food and drink for the men to last them 3 years. 1,000 books were also available to anyone who wanted to do something to pass the time, other than drink, of course. Number 3, the journey ends. The Erebus and Terror began their journey on May 19, 1845, with 134 officers and crew, and a supply ship, the Barretto Jr., followed them on their first leg. Their initial goal was to make it to Greenland, and they accomplished that in July. There, the ships would be supplied and letters home were sent to Britain on the Barretto. Crew members who faced illness or disciplinary issues during the first part of the journey were assigned to the Barretto for the return trip home. The total officers and crew numbered 129 upon the departure of the supply ship. Their next stop was sailing into the waters of Canada and then reaching Beechey Island, which is located on Devon Island near the Barrow Strait. According to records, they arrived at this location and were scheduled to stay for the winter until the following year. The ships were last spotted by a whaling ship as they sailed into Baffin Bay in July of 1845. The captain of the whaling ship noted that the crew of the Erebus and Terror were in high spirits. And from this point forward, there was no communication from the Erebus and Terror. It was 2 years after they'd set sail that the families of the crew began to worry that the ships had met a terrible fate. Do you think you have what it takes to survive the Arctic? Would you like to see more videos on the subject like this one? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below, and while you're at it, subscribe. 2. A new search begins. What's known from searches that were conducted from 1854 to the present is that Franklin and his men set up camp on Beechey Island. Tents were discovered at the site, and there was evidence that a blacksmith had set up a work area as well. But the evidence that stood out were the graves. 3 of the men on the mission died and were buried at Beechey Island, and their names were John Hartnell, William Brain, and John Torrington. Both the Erebus and the Terror were frozen in the ice near Beechey Island. The thaw would free their ships eventually, but they had to make do until that happened. They had books, plenty to drink, and a large amount of canned food. But when graves on the island were discovered, something else was found with them, a large pile of cans for the food. So what happened? Usually, if a naval expedition docked somewhere, they would leave something in writing for others to read just in case. But the officers and crew on this expedition didn't adhere to this simple protocol. The graves and the cans were the first clues in the mystery. When Beechey Island was investigated, no ships were located. That means that Franklin and his men decided to go somewhere else, but that somewhere else wasn't known. These men simply vanished. Back in Britain, Lady Jane Franklin, the wife of Sir John Franklin, was persistent in lobbying for a search party to find her husband. It was ignored at first, but her persistence eventually paid off. A reward of £20,000, which in today's market would be well over $600,000, was offered for the finding of Franklin and his crew. This got the attention of certain individuals, and they decided to find Franklin and claim the reward. One journey in 1850 was a joint United States and British search for the ships and crew. They landed at Beechey Island and were the ones that discovered the graves. Ice proved to be an issue, but nothing else was reported until a year later. That's when an iceberg was spotted off the coast of Newfoundland, and according to witnesses, attached to the iceberg were 2 ships, but those who spotted the iceberg couldn't tell if the ships were the Erebus or the Terror. The biggest lead came in 1854, when John Ray was on an Arctic expedition of his own. Ray wasn't searching for the Franklin expedition, though. He was exploring the Boothia Peninsula in the Canadian Arctic. The area Ray was exploring was south of Beechey Island, and during his time in Canada, he met some Inuit people who taught him something shocking. With the help of a local Inuit man named Marco, Ray learned that the Inuit had stories of white men who died on King William Island. Their deaths were possibly dated to 1850, and Ray wanted to hear more about these men. Ray also learned that the Inuit had items that belonged to the men, and Ray was able to purchase these items with the aid of Marco. These items included silverware and a plate. They had identifying information on them that linked the objects to officers who were with Franklin's expedition. At that time, men who served on ships would bring their own utensils and plates among other items. Ray's discovery was a huge step in solving a major mystery. The Inuit had something else to share as well. They stated that the men who died on King William Island had resorted to cannibalism to stay alive. But this news was almost too shocking for Ray to accept. It was 5 months after learning the fate of the Franklin expedition that John Rae provided his findings in Britain. His report was met with a great deal of criticism, especially from Lady Jane Franklin. Many were shocked that Rae would believe the Inuits' tale of the men resorting to cannibalism, and Lady Franklin was also furious with Rae for not doing a better investigation while in the Arctic region of Canada. He could have ventured to the location where the men had reportedly died. It was Lady Franklin's opinion that Rae wanted the reward money. Charles Dickens, the famous British writer, was a friend of Lady Jane Franklin and penned some scathing public letters about Rae's ridiculous claims because civilized men from Britain would never lower themselves to become cannibals. But Rae fired back with his public rebuttal and stood up for the Inuit people and their stories about the crew. By 1857, Lady Jane Franklin needed someone else to lead an expedition to find her husband and his crew, so she convinced Francis McClintock to take up the task and search the Arctic region of Canada. McClintock was a man with a great deal of naval experience. He'd even searched for the Erebus and Terror in 1848. McClintock was part of a search party led by James Ross Clark, a man with an impressive background in exploring the Arctic. The 1848 search had trouble navigating the ice in the Arctic, but they did land at Somerset Island, which is south of Devon Island, where Beechey Island is located. Unfortunately, though, their search uncovered nothing, and they returned to Britain. McClintock was called up in 1850 for another mission to the Arctic. He had plenty of experience on land and sea, so he didn't hesitate to take on the task. McClintock's next trip to the Arctic to find Franklin, the crew, and the missing ships began in 1857. Lady Jane purchased a ship for the mission and made sure it was properly fitted for McClintock's voyage to the Arctic. The vessel, a steam yacht named Fox, and McClintock sailed with a crew of 25 who were equipped with sleds to be pulled by a team of dogs across the tundra, and they were on their mission from 1857 until 1859. When McClintock reached the Arctic, he met with Inuit people who had in their possession personal items from the crew of the Erebus and Terror. They told McClintock that they believed one of the ships was destroyed near King William Island by the ice. McClintock had no choice but to explore the island for anything related to the fate of the expedition. They found more personal items from the crew, and they discovered one of the smaller boats that was used by the Erebus or Terror. That's where they found the crew's remains, along with their personal belongings that were scattered about. There was something else that was discovered by the McClintock crew. They found a pile of rubble or stone, and inside of that was a naval document in a tube that included the signatures of James Fitzjames and Francis Crozier. They examined what had been written, and it was shocking. The crew of the Erebus and Terror were at Beechey Island, but in September of 1846, they made their way to King William Island, where they would get trapped in ice for a second time. There was also some distressing news. The message they found was updated in April 1848, and it listed the names of 24 men who had died. And sadly, one of the men who had died was Sir John Franklin. Also written was that the surviving officers and crew, some 105 men in total, were making a difficult trek west across the frozen land towards the Back River. The Erebus and Terror were stuck in the ice until 1848, and they were tired of the situation. So walking across the frozen landscape was their last resort. McClintock returned to Britain with his findings, but it wasn't the last expedition to the Arctic to find the men. During the late 1800s, two Americans, Charles Francis Hall and Frederick Schwatka, made separate trips to find out what happened to the crew of the Erebus and Terror. With the aid of the Inuit community, Hall and Schwatka gathered more personal belongings from their crew, and they gathered vital information about the whereabouts of the ships. They also learned details of where the crews may have trekked to find assistance. Number 1. Later discoveries. Research and exploration continued into the 20th and 21st centuries for the Franklin expedition. Those buried on Beechey Island and the remains found on King William Island were examined for possible causes of death. Some tests showed that they had an astounding level of lead in their body. This meant that lead poisoning was the issue. But how in the world did it happen? Both the Erebus and the Terror had large supplies of canned food. The cans were also tested, and it provided an essential clue. Improper canning methods involved the use of lead. If the crew ate from the canned food, they were ingesting dangerous levels of the metal. The men were poisoned, and that resulted in weakness as well as a mental breakdown. At some point, the officers and crew of the ships may have realized that the cans were the problem. And if that were the case, they had no choice but to avoid eating the lead-contaminated food. Other issues like hypothermia and starvation only made things worse for the surviving members. This doesn't even include other diseases like scurvy or tuberculosis. One of the remains found on King William Island proved that the Inuit people were right about the claims of cannibalism. It was a last resort for the survival of these men. The Erebus and Terror eluded researchers for many years, but they were discovered between 2014 and 2016. The Erebus was the first to be located. Various governments and private organizations worked with the Inuit to search for the two ships. They've both since been found underwater, and the wreckage has been studied for years. What voyages gone wrong would you like us to cover in upcoming episodes? Let us know in the comments down below. And if you enjoyed this video, be sure to leave a like and subscribe to the channel. Thanks so much for watching. We'll see you in the next one. Bye for now.